Okay, so, here at the Deep Dive, we always try to bring you stuff that's, relevant and interesting. And today we're tackling something that's uh, pretty specific, but honestly could be a lifesaver for some of you out there.
Absolutely.
We're diving into Text5 from a postgraduate entrance exam. Yeah, we're talking about the English reading comprehension section.
The one that can feel like a total puzzle.
Exactly. And if you're someone who, gets a little intimidated by that whole English part, well, consider this your decoder ring. We're going to break this text down bit by bit so it's not so alien.
That's right. We're not just going to tell you what's in the article. We're going to show you how it works. The sentences, the words, even those tricky questions, we're going to unpack it all. We're aiming for like a clear path, not a mountain climb. So you can build up that confidence with English reading in general. No need to get all fancy and academic today. We're keeping it simple.
Love that. Simple is good. So this Text5, it's all about this huge thing happening in the business world, right? Companies merging, buying each other out, M&A.
M&A? Yep, that's the shorthand you'll see a lot.
So the article dives into why this is going on and if it's, a good thing, a bad thing, particularly that question of whether these massive companies are getting too powerful. There are some examples in there, and it ends with a bit of a cautionary note, I guess you could say.
A little bit of, hey, let's keep an eye on this.
Exactly. Okay, so before we get lost in the weeds, what's the big picture here? Like, what's this whole thing even about?
Imagine this. You've got a couple of bakeries in a town, right? They're both doing their thing, baking bread, making cakes. Now, a merger would be like if they decided to join forces, become one big mega bakery.
Okay, following.
An acquisition, on the other hand, is when one bakery buys the other one completely, takes over.
Like swallows it up.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And what this article is saying is that this kind of thing, this joining or buying, it's happening more and more, not just with bakeries, but with companies all over the world.
Like a wave, right?
Yeah.
That's what the article says.
A huge wave of M&A, exactly, spreading out from the busy business hubs like America across to Europe. And it's reaching even those countries that are still developing their economies. And it's not doing it gently. It's happening with like a lot of force.
So it's not just that it's happening, it's the way it's happening that's making people pay attention.
Right, because it raises some questions. Like, if all these companies are merging and getting bigger and bigger, does that mean fewer choices for everyone else? Does it mean these giant companies could have too much power?
Yeah, that's the worry the article brings up pretty early on, this idea of too much power concentrated in just a few really big companies. What kind of problems could that lead to?
Well, the biggest one is probably competition or lack of it. If you only have a handful of huge companies calling the shots, they might not feel the need to keep prices low or to come up with new and better stuff. Why bother if there's no one else to challenge them, right?
No pressure to innovate
Sure.
or keep things affordable.
Exactly. And it also makes it way harder for smaller companies to, get started and actually compete. That's why the article talks about this potential uncontrollable anti-competitive force, basically a power that squashes competition and is really hard to stop.
Okay, so we've got the context, the big picture. Now, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the English itself. I got to say, some of these sentences, they can be real tongue twisters.
It can be a bit much, yeah.
Like that one in the first paragraph, the second sentence. The process sweeps from hyperactive America to Europe and reaches the emerging countries with unsurpassed might. I mean, if you're reading that and your brain's doing a little spin, you're not alone.
Definitely not. But like we said, we're going to untangle it step by step.
Perfect. Lead the way.
Okay, so at its core, this sentence is saying, the process sweeps. Now, the process is just a fancy way of talking about this whole merger and acquisition trend we've been discussing.
Okay, so we're talking about that big wave, the M&A thing.
Right. And sweeps is like saying it's moving fast and covering a lot of ground, like a broom sweeping across the floor.
I get it. So the process moves quickly, but where's it going?
Good question. The sentence tells us, from hyperactive America to Europe. That from.to structure shows us the direction, the path it's taking.
Okay, so it starts in hyperactive America. That paints a pretty vivid picture, doesn't it?
It does. It's like saying America is buzzing with business deals. It's the starting point for this sweeping movement. And then it moves towards Europe. These little phrases from hyperactive America to Europe, they're called prepositional phrases, like those extra details, those little notes that tell you where the action's happening.
Yeah, the color, the flavor.
Exactly. And then we have and reaches the emerging countries. That and is important. It's a connector, linking another action to the same process. So it's not just sweeping from America to Europe, it's also arriving in those emerging countries, the ones that are still developing their economy.
So it's spreading out further and further.
Yes, and the last part tells us how. With unsurpassed might. Might means power, force, like something really strong. And unsurpassed means no one can top it. It's the best, the most powerful.
Okay, so with unsurpassed might is like saying it's reaching these emerging countries with a power that can't be matched.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful image, right? If we wanted to translate this whole sentence simply into Chinese, it would be something like, 物体没有否当 swatch 不负责.
It kind of loses some of the dramatic flair, doesn't it?
It does. The English version is more descriptive. It lays out the action, the direction, the power, all in one sentence.
Okay, let's tackle another one from the second paragraph, the very first sentence. There's no question that the big cuts are getting bigger and more powerful. This one feels like it's making a bold statement.
It is, and it uses a common English structure to do that.
Break it down for us.
Okay, so there's no question that.
Right.
It's like saying, it's absolutely true that, or this is a fact, no doubt about it. It's a way to emphasize what you're about to say.
Like a drum roll.
Exactly. And then it says, the big are getting bigger and more powerful. Now, the big isn't talking about, like, giant pandas or something. It's using big as a noun to talk about big companies.
Ah, like shorthand.
Yes. And then are getting bigger and more powerful is describing something that's happening continuously. Getting bigger means their size, their reach is increasing. Getting more powerful means they're gaining more influence, more control.
So in simple Chinese, it's like yam, sham, ho bias.
Shuso.
Exactly. Another pretty straightforward sentence structure expressing a clear idea.
Okay, I'm feeling more confident already. But there's this one part from the first sentence of the third paragraph. Enlarged markets that require enlarged operations capable of meeting customers' demands. This one's a bit of a mouthful.
It's like a bunch of train cars all hooked together. Let's see if we can uncouple them one by one.
I like that analogy. Okay, where do we start? With the first car. Enlarged markets. Enlarged just means bigger, right? So these markets have expanded, maybe because of globalization, maybe because there are more customers.
More people wanting stuff.
Exactly. Now, the next car is where it gets tricky. That require enlarged operations. This is what we call a relative clause. That little word that is like a stand-in for enlarged markets.
I would say these bigger markets, they require something.
Yes. And what they require is enlarged operations. Operations are all the things a company does to make and sell its products or services.
Like manufacturing, shipping, advertising, all that jazz.
Exactly. And enlarged operations just means they need to do all that on a bigger scale to keep up with those bigger markets.
So the markets are growing, and what companies do also has to grow.
Right. And the last car describes what those bigger operations have to be able to do. Capable of meeting customers' demands. Capable of means able to. And meeting customers' demands means giving people what they want, satisfying their needs. So if we put it all together, it's like saying, shishu, chin. It's like a chain reaction. One thing leads to another.
Exactly. And you see how that little word that connects the markets to their need for bigger operations, and then that last phrase describes what those operations need to be able to do.
It's like a little puzzle. But once you see how the pieces fit, it's not so bad.
And speaking of fitting pieces together, those connecting words are so important. Words like and, but, because, so they're like the signs on the road, telling you where the argument's going.
Giving you directions.
Exactly. And adds information or links similar ideas, but signals a change, a contrast. Because gives you a reason, and so shows you a result. Pay attention to these, they'll help you follow the author's logic.
Okay, good tip. Now, how about those tricky words and phrases? The ones that make you go, huh? Let's unpack some of those. First off, mergers and acquisitions, or M&A for short. We've been throwing that around a lot, but just to be crystal clear, a merger is when companies combine to form one bigger company. An acquisition is when one company buys another one completely.
It's like the main dish of this whole article.
It is. Then we have concentration. In this article, it's all about things becoming more clustered, more focused in one place. In this case, it's about fewer but much larger companies controlling a bigger slice of the market.
Like instead of 10 small pizzerias, you have one mega pizza corporation.
Exactly. That's concentration of power. Then there's that phrase, uncontrollable anti-competitive force. It sounds intimidating, but let's break it down. Uncontrollable means you can't stop it, you can't manage it. Anti-competitive is anything that prevents fair competition, that gives some companies an unfair advantage.
So basically, it's like a runaway train that's squashing all the smaller businesses.
Kind of. It's a powerful force that's messing up the balance, and you can't do anything about it. Then we have multinational corporations, which basically means companies that do business in lots of different countries all over the world.
Global players.
Yep. And a related term is affiliates. These are like the branches of a big company, the connected parts that are still part of the same larger organization, like a tree with lots of branches.
Makes sense.
Now, two words that are opposites and worth noting are beneficial and detrimental. Beneficial means good, helpful, advantageous. Detrimental means the opposite, harmful, damaging. It's important to know which is which.
Good versus bad, basically.
Exactly. And then there's scanty, which means very few, not enough. Like the article mentions that clear examples of the good or bad effects of this M&A wave are still scanty, meaning there's not a lot of evidence yet.
It's still early days.
Right. Then we have threats to competition, which is pretty self-explanatory things that could harm fair business practices. And warned against means someone is saying, hey, be careful, this could be a problem, like a caution sign.
A heads up.
Exactly. And then there's infringements, which means breaking a rule or a law. In business, it could be doing something that goes against fair competition. And finally, fair competition itself. That just means a level playing field where everyone has a chance to succeed. No one's cheating or using dirty tactics.
Okay, so that's a lot of vocabulary. Any advice for, remembering all this?
Definitely. Always pay attention to the context, the words around the word you're unsure of. They can often give you clues about the meaning. And don't be afraid to look up words you don't know. Building up your vocabulary is a marathon, not a sprint.
Makes sense. So we've talked about the big picture. We've dissected some sentences. We've deciphered some vocabulary. Now, how about those exam questions? The ones that actually determine your score.
Let's tackle them. Starting with question 1. What is the typical trend of businesses today? This one's asking us to identify the main thing that businesses are doing right now.
The big pattern.
Exactly. And if we go back to the very beginning of the article, it hits us right away. The world is going through the biggest wave of mergers and acquisitions ever witnessed. That tells us the main trend is companies joining together or buying each other up.
On a massive scale.
Yes. Now let's look at the answers. A says to take in more foreign funds. Well, M&A can involve international investment, but that's not the main trend the article highlights at the start.
It's not the big picture.
Right. B is to invest more abroad. Again, this relates to globalization, which the article mentions later, but it's not the central trend in that opening sentence. D says to trade with more countries. Also connected to globalization, but not the specific business trend we're focused on.
So we're narrowing it down.
Exactly. And that leaves us with C, to combine and become bigger. This perfectly matches the idea of mergers, combining, and acquisitions getting bigger. So based on that strong opening statement, C is the most accurate answer.
Okay, on to question 2. According to the author, one of the driving forces behind the M&A wave is, so this one's digging into the why.
Yes, the reasons behind this trend. To find the answer, we need to look for where the author explains those reasons. And we find that in the third paragraph. The author says, I believe that the most important forces behind the massive M&A wave are the same that underlie the globalization process. Falling transportation and communication costs, lower trade and investment barriers, and enlarged markets that require enlarged operations capable of meeting customers' demands. That last part seems key.
It does. It's talking about bigger markets and the need to keep customers happy.
Exactly. Now let's check the answers. A is the greater customer demands. The text talks about enlarged markets that require enlarged operations capable of meeting customers' demands. So the need to satisfy those customers in those bigger markets is a driving force, making a strong possibility.
Okay, what about the other options?
B says a surplus supply for the market. The article doesn't say anything about having too much stuff as a reason for M&A. C is a growing productivity. While increased productivity might be a result of M&A sometimes, it's not given as a primary cause here. And D is the increase of the world's wealth. Again, this might be a broader factor, but the author specifically links the M&A wave to globalization and meeting customer demands in those bigger markets. So A seems to be the answer that's most directly supported by the text.
Okay, on to question 3. From paragraph 4, we can infer that. Now remember, infer means to figure something out based on what's written, even if it's not directly stated.
It's like reading between the lines.
Right, so paragraph 4 talks about potential benefits and drawbacks of M&A, noting that clear examples of both are scanty, meaning we don't have a lot of concrete evidence yet.
Right.
Then it brings up the example of oil companies merging and compares it to the Standard Oil Trust being broken up way back when because people were worried about competition being stifled. The author suggests that these current oil mergers might not be exactly the same as that old Standard Oil Trust situation.
Okay, let's see what the answers say. A claims the increasing concentration is certain to hurt consumers. But the author isn't being that definitive. They're saying clear negative examples are still scarce, not that it's a guaranteed bad thing.
So A is too strong.
Right. B says WorldCom serves as a good example of both benefits and costs. But WorldCom is only mentioned in the context of not raising prices or slowing progress, not as a clear example of both good and bad.
No.
C claims the costs of the globalization process are enormous. The article talks about M&A within globalization, but it doesn't make such a sweeping statement about the overall costs of globalization.
So that leaves us with D. The Standard Oil Trust might have threatened competition. The author brings up this example of the Standard Oil Trust being broken up because people were worried about its power and the potential harm to competition. By mentioning it, the author implies that it was seen as a threat back then.
And that might have threatened is important. It's cautious, acknowledging that we're making an educated guess based on what the text tells us. So D is the most logical inference we can draw from that paragraph.
Makes sense. Last question. Toward the new business wave, the writer's attitude can be said to be. So this is about how the author feels about all this M&A stuff.
Their overall perspective, their tone, do they sound super excited, super worried, or somewhere in between?
Right. So they start by talking about how big this wave is and mention those concerns about anti-competitive forces. But then they discuss potential positives linked to globalization. They say clear negative examples are hard to find right now, but they still say this whole thing must be watched, even bringing up Alan Greenspan's worries.
Okay, good summary. Let's look at the options. A is optimistic, which means the author thinks it's all going to be great, no problems. But that doesn't fit with the warnings.
You rosy.
Right. C is pessimistic, meaning the author thinks it's all going to go downhill. But they do acknowledge potential benefits, so that's not quite right either. D is biased, meaning the author is clearly taking sides, not being balanced.
So that leaves B, objective, which means the author is trying to present a fair and balanced view, looking at both the good and the bad.
Exactly. They're acknowledging the drivers, the benefits, but also the concerns, the need for caution. That seems to describe the overall tone best. They're not saying M&A is definitely good or bad, but rather, hey, this is a complex issue with multiple sides.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm sure some of our listeners are still, scratching their heads a little. What are some common things people struggle with when they encounter a text like this?
One big one is those long, complicated sentences we talked about earlier. It can feel overwhelming. One helpful strategy is to find the main subject and the main verb first. Who or what is doing the action? Once you've got that, you can start breaking down the rest of the sentence into smaller chunks.
Like building blocks.
Exactly. Another common hurdle is vocabulary, especially those more abstract words. If you come across a word you don't know, try looking for clues in the surrounding sentences. Sometimes the context can give you hints about the meaning.
Like a detective?
Exactly. If the context doesn't help, make a note of the word and look it up later. Building your vocabulary takes time and effort. And when you're asked to infer meaning, remember that your inferences should always be based on what the text says. Don't bring in your own assumptions or outside knowledge. Stick to the clues in the article.
Good advice. And finally, for those multiple choice questions, always read all the answer options carefully. Don't just jump on the first one that seems okay. Eliminate the options that are clearly wrong or not mentioned in the text. It's a process of elimination, like a puzzle.
Exactly. Okay, so to sum it all up, in this deep dive, we've gone deep into Text5, this article about the global trend of M&A. We've talked about the main ideas, the reasons behind it, the potential concerns. We've broken down tricky sentences, explained key vocabulary, and given you some strategies for tackling those comprehension questions.
And the big takeaway here, especially for those of you prepping for exams, is that building a solid foundation is key. Understand basic sentence structure, know the meanings of common words. That's the groundwork for tackling tougher texts.
Like learning your ABCs before you can write a novel.
Exactly. And on that note, Here's a thought to chew on. Given that companies are merging and getting bigger all the time, what do you think will decide whether this trend ends up being good or bad for the world economy in the long run? A big question, something to ponder beyond just this one exam.
Definitely something to think about.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and happy studying.
Until next time.